You might have started landscape photography, but do you actually make good pictures? One of the key factors in making great photographs is to be able to identify the subject when you see it. And I'm not just talking about the most obvious subjects, like mountains or the sun or waterfalls. I'm talking about being able to find interesting subjects wherever you go, because it's only when you are able to do that that you can call yourself a good photographer. Being able to create beautiful and emotional and meaningful photos requires you to be able to find the interesting subject which your photo will be centered around. So in this video, I want to go over 7 different ways that I have learned to be able to identify interesting subjects and be able to create meaningful photos to me. And the first way is actually pretty interesting because it's centered around reverse engineering composition. Usually when we are trying to compose something around a subject, we're trying to guide the viewer's attention to that subject. And so in order to be able to reverse engineer that, we want to find interesting things which will create a visual flow and then maybe identify whatever lies at the center of that visual flow. For this photo, I actually found this metallic sundial before I was able to identify what would lie at the center of it. But I know I wanted to use the sundial as an arabesque to kind of guide the viewer into the center of the photo. Sometimes you might find a lot of leading lines, and being able to determine where that line leads to, because it might lead to an interesting subject, or that line might just be creating a very clean separation to create a very visually aesthetic image like this one. The next way that I would recommend is to find interesting light. Usually we want to find a subject and then be able to identify how the light is changing and maybe even wait for the light to fall in certain ways so that the subject is enhanced. Another way to think about this is actually find where that interesting light is and then see if there are interesting subjects in that space. So for example, for this photo, I was surrounded by a bunch of buildings, but I knew that the light might be peeking through some of the buildings. So I looked around and found this really nice glow effect on the side of a building. And then this flag just happened to be there and create a very interesting subject for this photo. Similarly for this photo, I saw this beautiful light shining through the windows of this subway tunnel. And I knew I wanted to do something with that light. I saw a lot of birds flying about, and I would notice that when the birds flew through it, they would create this interesting glow in certain areas on their wings. And so that led me to use the light to create a subject of interest, which is the bird in this photo. This photo might have a lot of atmosphere in it, but it doesn't really have the more conventional subject that you might think of. But I think for me, the subject of this image is the contrasting light and the small sliver of brighter light when it shines through on one side of the mountain. So I was looking for where the light might be shining more brightly on a side of a mountain, and then use that to create a contrasting effect with the mountain that is in shadow behind it. All right, the next way that I like to use is keeping a lookout for contrasting subjects. A lot of times when we're walking around, we're not really going to be aware of what it is that might make a good subject. And so our eyes are particularly drawn to things which have a lot of contrast, whether it's in shape, color, or size. Things that are different from the things around it draw our attention, and it's very easy to then pick out those things with our eyes and then see if we can make composition around it. For example, for this photo, there's very sharp contrast in the color between the log and the leaf, and then the log and the surrounding water and the light that is shining and being reflected from that water. The reason these flowers drew my attention is because they were just stark bright yellow against the blue background during the early mornings of the day, and I was able to make a composition out of that. For this photo, I was attracted to these clover leaves because they just stood out against the type of grass around it. Similarly, for this tree, it just stood out a lot more against the green and yellow background leaves of the other trees. And so that became my main subject. All right, so the next tip might be a little bit more controversial because it goes into using wildlife in our landscape photography. And although we are using wildlife, we're not actually trying to do wildlife photography. We're trying to use wildlife to really enhance and create the atmosphere of the landscape around it, rather than focusing primarily on the wildlife itself, as a lot of wildlife photographers do. At this river, there was a really nice mist and glow cast by the early morning sun, but I needed something to create an interesting subject, and so I was constantly on the lookout for geese or ducks in the water to act as the main subject for that specific environment. Again, very similar for this photo. I was looking out for wildlife to be able to create an interesting subject matter for the background, which is the fog-covered trees in the back. For this photo, I really loved the effect of the green in the middle of summer, but I needed something to tie it all together. And so I was looking out for deer that were crossing. So I was positioned further away so that the deer would know that there is space for them to cross, and then waited for a deer to come into the middle of the frame. All right, let's move on to the next thing that I try to look out for to create interesting subjects, which is patterns and texture. The There are a lot of different interesting textures and patterns everywhere, but it does take some practice, and by this I mean being intentional while looking out for interesting textures around you. Whether it is just something as simple as a farm field or ripples in the water, those can create really interesting patterns through which you can create something more abstract, or use those patterns to create a holistic image around a subject within those patterns. So this image of oil and the rocks create an interesting textural feel to it, and even though the leaf doesn't stand out as starkly against all the elements in this photo, I think the contrasting effect of the rocks and the oil does create an interesting subject for this photo. You can obviously tell that this photo has something to do with a waterfall, but it was the interesting layers of water that were created in the waterfall that I was mostly focused on, because that created an interesting aesthetic image. Alright, so the next thing to look out for, and I should preface this by saying it's really useful in local landscapes because it can create really powerful and simple, clean aesthetic images, and I'm talking about reflections. There's a lot of reflections in different bodies of water, whether it's a stagnant river or a pond. You might have to wait for the water to be a little bit more still, but you can still use long exposures to kind of create a really nice, clean look in the water. For this image, I was actually looking at things close to the water because I wanted to see if something interesting in the form of a reflection would pop out. But even though I didn't use the whole reflection in this, looking out for reflections helped me identify this interesting subject, which actually became my favorite photo. It doesn't even have to be reflections of complete objects. This is one of my favorite abstract images that I created because I saw interesting reflections of light in the water, so much so that it resembled something like magma. And at that time, there was actually hype around a volcano erupting in Iceland. And even though I couldn't be in Iceland at that time, I was able to still create an image that really resembled the feeling of magma and rock. And finally, the last tip, and one which I use very often in my local landscape photography, is using negative space. I actually made a whole video about this, which you can check out with a link up above. But what I'm trying to say is find areas with a lot of negative space, whether it's a body of water or if it's very dense fog, and then look out for something that just stands out against that stark negative space. And you can even do this in urban photography because nighttime creates a lot of interesting negative space, and then street lamps will cast light on certain areas which can create interest in that subject that might be there or might just actually be walking through it, like in this photo. But looking out for negative space is another way to kind of reverse engineer finding interesting subjects, because now you're trying to find the negative space first and then allow your mind to immediately be drawn to interesting subjects that might stand out in that negative space. These were just a few tips that I've learned to really help me find those interesting subjects in my local landscapes, as well as epic landscapes when I go out there and I don't want to take a very conventional photo. Because it's when you are able to identify those interesting subjects that you'll actually be able to create more meaningful photos rather than just replicating the most iconic shots all the time instead. There's nothing wrong with taking more iconic shots, but being able to identify subjects by yourself without relying on other people's photos is a necessary tool for every photographer to become great. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if there are interesting subjects that you are particularly drawn to, or if you have different ways to find those interesting subjects, let me know down below in the comments because I'd also love to learn as well, and I'll see you next time.